Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so glad you've joined me this evening. I love you guys so very much. And I've got such an exciting story for you today. It's about an abduction, which I know you're going to enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on any of the Bigfoot stories that I've got coming up. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, I have not told many people the story because when it happened to me in the early 1970s, most people had never heard of Bigfoot before. I was 11 years old in the spring of 1972 when my parents decided to take a day's excursion to the National Forest somewhere in Virginia. I really do not remember the specific location of my encounter, but I do remember the day that I was abducted by a Bigfoot with vivid clarity. My parents decided it would be nice to go for a picnic, as my mother's sister, Monique, was staying with us for a few days. She lived in Houston in Texas. My mother liked to always show her a good time when she came to stay with us in Virginia. Monique was married with 2 children, James, who was 10, and Jesse, who was 12. Even though Monique's children were boys, they never treated me like a girl because they always included me in their games, and so I liked them for that. So it was on a beautiful Sunday morning that all 7 of us found ourselves walking in the National Forest. And as children we had heaps of fun. We played I Spy and we chased each other in the woods until we were thoroughly exhausted. My father had set up a day camp and had made a fire in the woods where we barbecued some delicious spatchcock chickens on an open grill, which we served with salad, cornbread and potato salad. While my parents chatted away happily, the boys and I decided to play hide and seek. Jesse started to count, while James and I scattered away quickly, trying to locate the perfect spot to hide. It's easy hiding in the woods because of the ubiquitous trees everywhere. I found the most perfect tree to hide behind, with a very large girth, covered with lots of moss and with hollow indentations in the bark. And on one side there was a large cleavage where I could squeeze my body into that hollow without being seen. I was very pleased because I felt convinced that Jesse would never be able to find me. "Coming, whether you're ready or not," came Jesse's voice. I stood very still because I could hear the crunching of the forest litter under heavy feet. Has Jesse already guessed where I'm hiding, I wondered, feeling the inevitable disappointment rising in my heart. What a bummer, just when I had thought that I had found the most perfect hiding spot in the whole forest. Jesse was a light person with a very slight build, but on this day he sounded like an elephant on the forest floor. I thought he was making these heavy stomping sounds just to scare us. It's not working, I thought. At that moment it seemed like Jesse had stopped at the tree where I was hiding, and I could feel his eyes on me. My heart was pounding, and I closed my eyes tightly, hoping that if I stayed deadly still, he might not notice me squirreled away in the hollow of the tree corner. I heard a couple of heavy breaths, and I grinned to myself silently. Jesse was really using scare tactics to flush us out of our hiding places, I thought. At that moment, strong arms seized hold of my body and whirled me onto the top of a pair of large shoulders. I was hanging at about 8 feet off the ground and surrounded by a sea of 2-inch long sandy brown muddy hair that was matted and stunk horribly. It reminded me of a toy teddy bear I owned once and refused to have washed. Eventually my mother threw the thing away because its fur had become horridly bedraggled and our dog had peed over it a couple of times. The hair on this thing was just like that, but much smellier, a very acetone, like urine kind of smell. I was in shock, and no, I did not scream, not at first. I felt so shocked by what was happening to me that I really believed I was dreaming and was about to wake up from a horrible nightmare. That's how surreal it all felt. The creature that was carrying me was enormous, and he literally glided as he walked. I did not feel that bumpiness you get on horseback. He carried me with such fluidity it was extraordinary, and I could tell that in his arms I was lighter than a feather. As he carried me, I got a good view of his feet, and they were enormous. I really believed I was in the arms of a giant, hairy monster, a creature that had hairy human-like feet and legs, feet and hands. I do remember calling out, "Help!" but my voice did not come out in a scream. I just remember gentle cries coming out, "Mum, Dad, please help!" But I couldn't scream. Tears just poured down my face. I honestly do not know what I felt at that moment. I was so numb with the shock that the immense fear robbed my body of any real emotion and any desire to fight back. The creature moved so fast that in seconds I knew that the picnic spot where my parents were chatting was long since left behind us. The creature appeared to be walking uphill, and all this time he made no sounds. Eventually we came to a clearing where the creature removed some mossy covering on the forest floor, which covered a hole in the ground. The creature literally jumped into the hollow with me on his back and landed so smoothly, like a cat jumping from a kitchen surface to the floor. Inside the hole was this large underground tunnel that looked like those underground air raid shelters from World War II. It was so cleverly hidden. I doubt a human being would ever be able to notice it. I was surprised to find it was not too dark in the tunnel, as streams of sunlight filtered into the whole area. I noticed there was a couple of smooth, large boulders on the ground that looked like makeshift chairs, and there was a large corner of the tunnel filled with grasses and twigs that looked like a nesting area. I assumed that that was where the creature slept. On a broken tree branch held up against the wall of the tunnel was a half-eaten carcass of an elk. The creature put me down so that my bottom landed with perfect precision on one of the smooth rocks, and then he studied me as if he was seeing me for the very first time. I just stood there gawking at him, hardly daring to believe at what I was looking at. What on earth is this creature, I wondered. His eyes looked curious but also pleased. Well, that was the impression I got, as if he had brought back a big trophy to admire. I did not get the impression I was on the dinner menu, because he threw me a piece of meat from the elk and looked surprised when I just left it there on the muddy floor. His actions gave me some hope, because I had never heard of a hunter feeding an animal before he ate it, so I knew that I would have to think of a way to finally escape. At that moment I heard a loud thump, and then there was another big creature standing in front of me, and I could see that she was female because of her breasts. I could tell she was not happy to see me. She suddenly started to chatter angrily at the male, and he would chatter back, and then she would chatter and he would chatter, and this went on for an age. I got a really good look at the creatures while they appeared to be arguing over me, as every time they were chattering away, she would glance at me with very disapproving eyes. I knew she did not want me in this little abode, and by the looks of things she really did call all the shots, because the male finally started hanging his head in shame like a schoolboy who had been reprimanded. The bodies of these creatures were covered in hair, much like a bear, and it was everywhere except on their faces. It was matted all over it with mud, and there were sharp needles, burrs, and pieces of shrubbery caught up in their hair, and it was a tangled mess. Their heads were cone-shaped, and their faces long and human-like, although the grey skin texture was tough like a rhino hide. The eyes were dark brown, the nose was flat, and the mouths were thin. The creatures had teeth like ours, only much bigger. The female stood up at about 8 foot tall, so she was much smaller than the 10-foot male, but both of them were very stocky and muscular, especially around the chest, shoulders, and upper arms. The legs were long and lanky, and the feet enormous. I watched the female scold the male. She even lunged towards him a few times and growled in a warning tone, "Ha! Ha!" Then suddenly, before I could even say Jack Robinson, the male scurried away like a naughty schoolboy, with my body slung over his shoulders like a sack of potatoes. This time the creature chose to run, and I found myself going through the forest at lightning speed, and it's once again, the run was far more fluid than a horse trot. It literally felt like we were gliding along the forest floor. As he ran, there were no boundaries, there were no barricades, because he trawled through the undergrowth, clearly oblivious of the sharp thorns that tore my skin to shreds in places. Finally, I could hear my mother's voice laughing, and I realized the creature was bringing me back to my parents, and I was so relieved. He dropped me on the ground, and I ran to my mother, howling and crying like a baby. "What on earth is the matter?" my mother asked. "I thought you were playing hide and seek. Jesse's been looking for you everywhere." I tried to explain that a humanoid ape-like creature had abducted me and taken me to his lair. Well, imagine my mother and aunt. They just hooted with laughter. They thought I was hilariously funny. My mother affectionately tossed my hair. "You mark my words," she said to Aunt Monique. "We have the makings of a fine comedian here." As you can imagine, I was gutted that my story fell on deaf ears, because no one believed me, not even for a minute. My mother was cross with me for getting so cut up by the needles in the undergrowth, and she scolded me for being so reckless. As for my cousins, Jesse was unhappy about me taking so long to give up my hiding place, and I could tell he had a big case of the sulks, so I just ignored him. I realized that my abduction ordeal only lasted for minutes, but that moment in time seemed to last forever, because everything seemed to go into such slow motion. All these years later, I have never told my story until now, because I knew it would be impossible to believe. I won't be in the slightest bit bothered if your listeners do not believe me, because I know it really happened. For obvious reasons, I would like to remain anonymous. Thank you so much for that lovely story. Until next time, good night and goodbye.